Assalamu alaikum dear students. I hope you are doing well and you are again interested in another lecture. This is lecture number 6 on public finance, MPA405. Now we have crossed a few major milestones while covering this lecture. More specifically, we have discussed the importance of the role of government, and we had defined a criteria for evaluating the role of the government in an economy. And then we have also, after taking it through the welfare economics perspective, we came to externalities, which were negative and positive externalities. And in the last lecture, we discussed in detail the cause theorem, which basically gave a market-oriented system to resolve any conflicts originating from either positive or negative externalities. In that lecture, we discussed that the government can assign property rights. If the government can establish the property rights, then the participants of the markets would automatically negotiate to the level where they would come to an efficient scenario. But then we also discussed that they're giving two examples of a rancher and a farmer, that how the assignment of property rights by the government would hinder the income allocation among the participants or among the affected parties. Now, specifically defining externalities, where which the cause of externalities was as defined was that if the two parties meeting in the market do not consider the effect on the third party of their transaction. So cause theorem, by establishing the property right and with the no transaction cost, would implement a solution which was market-based solution based on the negotiations and efficient resource allocation. However, income allocation was disturbed. But then we also studied certain cases, giving two examples, like a dilemma for the farmers who were like operating in rural areas, and the pollution generated by them was cleared by runoff through rain. But then if so many housing amenities start to develop in that area, that would result into a difficult scenario, whether if government establishes the property right to the farmer, then he would end up paying so many people. But if the government if the government establishes the property right to the farmer, then people developing that area would be in trouble. But if the government establishes the property right for those people shifting towards rural area, then those migrations and cost of living would, cost of living is very high in urban areas, that would again affect the income distribution. We again discussed a case in which, specifically talking about the US cities, where so much concrete and so much roads and buildings cause street flooding. And based on that scenario, we identified two parties. One party was developers, and the other party was the people who had previously built their homes around that in those cities or streets. Now, because of more development, there would be cost of in terms of more flooding to the old residents. But then in this case, we also discussed that assigning a property right would create a conflict again. We took this cause theorem towards Environmental Protection Agency in USA, where there was a concept of enforcement of environment protection laws, and again we discussed two scenarios where, like, command policies by EPA might not result into market efficient criteria and might increase administrative burdens. It might reduce innovation in pollution elimination. And using some analysis and drafts, and we concluded that specifically where the benefit to pollute, marginal social benefit to pollute towards firms might be different for two firms, and if a similar rule is applied to both the firms, then it would be difficult and they won't be producing efficiently. And same is the case when like two firms are operating in different geographical locations, like one is in rural areas and the other one is in urban area. Their marginal social benefit to pollute would be different from each other. And then in that case, if the government again allocates a specific law to control that externality, then the case would be again an inefficient level of production of pollution. Now, this all establishes the role of the government and importance of the role of the government, and role of the government in like eliminating positive externalities and negative externalities. And we are continuously discussing various theories based on which certain criteria can be evaluated. Now, in this lecture, we would be discussing like the public goods. This is basically the theme of this lecture. Public goods and theories about public goods, and we would again be discussing the criterias for allocation of more welfare to one individual without like making the other individual worst off. So public goods, what are public goods and what are private goods, and how government can intervene in the economy to either to provide the public good by themselves or like induce efficient environment in which the private sector can also take part in that sector. Before going to that, let us consider like specifically the USA's case or maybe Pakistan's case. Both are somewhat similar in this sense that like defense spending by both these countries have increased a lot over like past few decades. USA specifically with like due to war with Iraq or war in Afghanistan or general war on terrorism, and specifically Pakistan based on the war on terrorism. Now the issue is like this provision of defense that the government provides to its citizens is a public good, and what are the intricacies of this public good. Now let's compare the provision of defense with any other like production setup. Government need to employ capital and labor to produce defense. Now they also need to engage into certain contracts, just like if you are producing for example any other item, like for example chocolates. The production process would be same. You would be employing capital and labor, and then you would be producing certain quantity by engaging into contracts for labor, by engaging into contracts for capital. So similar process like any market oriented process takes place when the government engages into contracts to hire more labor and then engages into contracts to hire more capital. Then also the government takes up the R&D activities where they need to advance their capital. For example, stealth aircrafts, maybe intercontinental missiles, maybe for example any sort of better type of guns or machinery and equipment. So up till this point, the production process or the production function of the government would be the same as the private sector, but by the end of the production process, the whole scenario changes, because in case of for example if you are like you have a factory, or a private sector have a factory for producing chocolates, then what they would do is by the end of the production process they would have those packaged goods, and these packaged goods can be sold in the market at a specific price. But what does the government do? In case of this defense production, which is used by every citizen in the country, that defense cannot be packaged and sold, for example, to its citizens. So it is like, for example, if the government is providing defense to, for example, me or you or maybe some other people, then those people who are not paying for the defense would also be enjoying that defense service. So this is a strange category or a strange characteristic of the public good which we would be discussing today, and it of course creates a dilemma of choice for the government. It creates an issue of revenue generation for the government. It creates matters of like who would pay for the service and who would not pay for the service. And there are so many such public goods that are available and that are supposed to be provided by the government. So moving on, we also discussed like the externalities. Now there are like certain positive externalities. Positive externalities would be, in as we discussed, what are positive externalities? Like when a transaction between two parties benefits the third party in terms of marginal social benefit, and that cost of that or in terms of the price of that social benefit is not included in the original price of the product. So if it is not included in the price, then it would be a positive externality. So all these activities by the government, like so many of these activities, would have their positive externality. Like as it is mentioned in this slide, public goods are goods for which exclusion is impossible. One example is national defense. A military that defends its citizens from invasion does so for the entire public. Now if the government is like or the nation or the military is defending like for example half of its citizens, the other half would automatically be defended. So this is the criteria of a public good in which the exclusion is impossible. You cannot like defend like one or two or three people and let rest of the citizens bear cost of that invasion. So specifically in this case, the first issue is that the defense cannot be, as we were discussing before, that national defense cannot be packaged and sold like the items on the private sector. If the items, if these defense products cannot be packaged and sold, it is very difficult to mark to place a price tag on them. Then items like there are so many other things, like for example environment protection activities by the government, they also are enjoyed. Like if there is pollution free air, maybe for me only, then you would be automatically enjoying that pollution free air, and so would be so many other citizens in an economy, or in fact all the economic agents would be enjoying that good by the government. Production of such goods, if produced by the private sector, would have large externalities. Now the government can afford those externalities because those goods are made in that sense, because they have so many positive externality. But if the private sector produces such goods, they would put a price tag for that externality on that, and that would make those goods very expensive. And if those goods are made very expensive, it is not possible that easily to afford the use of those goods. Now these are the certain characteristics that we are going to discuss over here. The first characteristic of the public good is non-exclusion. That means the inability of a seller to prevent people from consuming good when they do not pay for it. As we were taking up with the example of national defense, or maybe pollution free air, or pollution free water, or all that stuff, and all those activities by the government, or for example providing insurance to the poor classes, or for example better road infrastructure. Now it would be very difficult for the government. There are certain excludable public goods. We would be coming to that, we would be discussing that, don't worry about it. We would actually make a table of categories of all the public and private goods. But what we are trying to do at this phase is we are trying to define the public goods. And while defining the public goods, we started with the basic example of national defense. Now I would like to summarize that before we move on. Before I want to clarify your concept, why national defense is a public good. Now let us assume that national defense is a public good because it is very difficult to exclude the people who are not paying for the national defense to use national defense, because they would be using national defense automatically. And so would be the case of clean pollution-free air or clean pollution-free water. And in this case, again, it would be very difficult for the government to exclude all those people who are not paying for the clean air. We discussed so many market-oriented incentives of Environment Protection Agency, like cap and trade, for example, in which they decided the maximum cap on emissions, and they in fact covered the emissions from the top, and so that there are no extra limits, no extra emissions by the factories, and then trade those emission permits. We create, and that would be a benefit to, an added benefit to the producers, and that was a market-oriented program. And then there was like bubble program, in which they could cover the industries. They would assume a hypothetical bowl-shaped bubble on top of one single industry, and then say that your total pollution should be up to this level. So if they would, maybe they would reduce carbon monoxide, so in case they want to increase, for example, carbon sulfate or any other chemical, which maybe I'm not sure of what sort of chemicals are produced. But the point is that that was again a market-oriented mechanism. Then there were like offset sort of policies, in which if you want to go into an area where the pollution limits are already achieved, then if the pollution limits are already achieved, you would the industry would ask other industries to reduce the level of pollution, and then maybe they would have to pay them to do that, and then they can start the business over there. And these are actual case studies which took place in USA based on these sort of agreements. Then there was banking agreement, in which if you do not use your complete permit, you could bank that for the future excess use, and do not pay fine for that. Now, what do these all policies bring into mind? Come on, I just explained that. Okay. Let me repeat that. Maybe some of you are wrong and some of you are right, but let me explain that. All these actions by the government generate positive externalities, right? So even if some people who are not paying for such actions of environmental protection agencies, like there is a whole topic of shadow economy, all the group of people who do not avoid, who actually avoid paying taxes and government fees and levies and operate in the gray area, they also enjoy all such benefits of such policies of the government. For example, the national defense, pollution-free environment, all the positive externalities originating out of these government policies. So it would be difficult to exclude those. Don't worry, shadow economy would be part of our discussion when we move on to government revenue and government expenditure. But over here, it is more important for us to understand the public goods and non-exclusion criteria, the inability of a seller to prevent people from consuming a good when they do not pay for it. Now, these, for example, it would be very difficult. Let's assume that any private sector get involved into putting up street lights in all the areas, or maybe they would plan to build a road which government does not allow them to pull get toll out of it. So where would be the benefit or profit orientation of such firms? Don't worry, again, as I said, we would be discussing more examples in which there is involvement of private sector, but over here we are talking about non-exclusion. So when there is less market orientation, it is involvement of the government, then these actions are decided by the ballot. For example, what we would do is, like when we vote for our political leaders to be elected in the government, we vote based on their policies. At least that is what is assumed, and what would be a rational voter would do. They would vote for the most beneficial policy maker. So once we vote for them, maybe somebody talks about the environment and we vote for it, then in that case again there is non-excludability, because if I vote for environment protection and you vote for example more industry and more employment generation that would cause more pollution, then if for example my policy maker wins, in that case you would also be enjoying the public good in terms of cleaner environment. So the cost of such all such policies and all such actions are decided by are financed through tax revenues of the government. That is why in certain cases governments has to increase their tax revenues, because environment protection has specifically in terms of developed countries, environment protection has asked a major chunk of government revenue to be invested in the economy, and either to subsidize, or there is a cost to every action of the government. So in short, tax revenue has been extensively utilized to protect the environment by developed countries, and they are doing so. They are pushing the developing countries also towards taking those steps after testing them in their own environment through international agencies and organizations. Then the second characteristic of public good is non-rivalry. Non-rivalry is that everybody can enjoy that public good without diminishing the chances for the other individual, because for example, if it is a private good is like, for example, maybe fish in the market. So if I buy fish from the market at a given price, then maybe the next guy won't have it because I have already bought it. There is a limited supply of that good. But in case of public goods, there is an extensive supply. As much as clean air I breathe, it won't create any shortage for you. As much as national defense is utilized to protect me, it would not create any shortage for the next guy sitting like maybe on the other side of the screen like you. So the definition would be the characteristic that if one person consumes a good, another person's pleasure is not diminished, nor is another person prevented from consuming it. This is another major characteristic of private good. So it is very difficult to put a price tag on a good which has a characteristics of non-exclusion and non-rivalry. All the private goods are rival goods. It would be very easy to put a price tag on a mobile phone or a chocolate, for example, or a mineral water bottle. So it would be very easy to do that, because those are rival goods, and all such rival goods might also have the characteristic of exclusion, because people only who can pay for it can buy it, and if people who can pay for it buy it, it reduces their total supply in the market, and the other people who want to buy it might not be able to approach it or use that or consume that good. So it is useless, in fact, to private the non-rival goods, to price the non-rival goods, because if you price the non-rival good, there is no for example benefit of paying that price, since I can use it anyhow. So, for example, TV programs, as we have been emphasizing on national defense as very optimal example of public good, so is the case would be TV programs. Now, do consider that TV programs are not non-exclusion types of public good, but they are non-rival public good, because if I switch on a channel of to watch a TV program, and if somebody else is also watching it, my consumption of that good, my watching that TV program would not reduce that television program for someone else. So as many people who can connect to the television set can watch that TV program. Now, do keep in mind that all non-rival goods are not always necessarily non-exclusion goods as well. Now, first of all, we have already established that it would be like unfeasible to try to price an non-exclusion good, because people cannot be excluded from it. Now, taking up two examples, for example, TV programs are all non-rival goods. Consumption of one individual would not reduce the consumption of other individual. But still it is an exclusion sort of a public good, because you can, like through cable television networks, you can exclude the people from using that good. So it is a non-rival good but also an exclusion good. In the similar case would be, for example, for roads. Now roads up to certain extent, we would discuss that later, road up to certain extent would be a non-rival good, because when congestions come in, that would increase the cost of traveling over there for existing people. So we would discuss that, don't worry. So non-rival goods is again a non-rival good. Let's assume that roads are a non-rival good up to a certain extent. Then in that case it might be an exclusion good, because you can install a toll plaza over there and you can only let people use it who are going to pay for it. And for example, Pakistan's motorway from Islamabad to Lahore and Peshawar and connecting the country nationwide, which is like in the plans at least, that would be a non-rival good, but it would also be an exclusion public good, because you can exclude people out of it who are not willing to pay for it. Okay, now moving on, for example, about pure public goods and pure private goods. Pure public goods are goods there is no ability to exclude and there is no rivalry for benefits. On the other hand, pure private good, there is clear ability to exclude and there is a rivalry for the benefits. Now, in generally speaking, market exchange for pure private goods is there is usually no externality, because when we were discussing externality, we established that usually the public goods have externalities, like people outside the transaction between two parties, which we call third parties, are benefiting or having a cost over it. But in case of pure private good, there are usually no externalities, and in that case people would be using it, only those who would be like willing to pay for it. And the cost of that externality would also be included into that. Since the pure public goods have wide ranging externalities and wide ranging, for example, external benefits, like for again going back to our examples like national defense, like roads, like clean air. Now there are wide ranging external benefits. There, like, you cannot target it for single individual. Even if you do target it for single individuals, then a wide majority, in fact most probably the whole people in the area or the country would be benefiting out of it. So in case of pure private goods, there are no externalities or minimal externalities in practical world, but in case of pure public goods, there are wide-ranging external benefits to the consumers. And again, if, for example, air pollution and national defense are pure public goods. Now, another thing which is important: marginal cost of provision of public goods. The marginal cost of allowing another person to benefit from a pure public good is zero, while the marginal cost of a greater level of public good is positive. Now, what does it mean? Like, for example, at a given quantity of a public good, now again going back to national defense, if we are assuming that national defense is a pure public good, if in fact it is a pure public good, we do not have to assume that. If national defense is a pure public good, then even if the population increases up to a certain level, and given the number of threats that are available outside the country, there is no marginal cost for allowing the existing amount of public good in terms of distribution. While on the other hand, in terms of production of more of the public good, there is, we assume, a constant average cost, and in other words, a constant marginal cost. We would discuss that, and we would explain that with a graph and try to understand this concept. Like, for example, on the x-axis there are number of consumers in this graph, and the graph is about marginal cost of distributing a pure public good. Now please stay focused that this is a pure public good, like national defense or for example cleaner air, cleaner water. Then on the y-axis there is cost in dollars. Now at a given amount, for example, number of consumers, marginal cost of allowing an additional person to consume a given quantity of pure public good would be 0. Why is that? It's very simple. Like for example, if the government has done already an expense of on the national defense, and the forces are established, the country's military is over there and it is protecting the borders of a country, with increase in population of few hundred thousands or few millions within those borders won't be affecting the cost, or won't have any marginal cost. You do not have to hire more tanks per every 10,000 number of births. The military is like there to protect the country and its borders and from foreign invasion. For example, we for few minutes we assume that there is no aggression going outside the country. For example, like in case of Afghanistan or Iraq wars, we are just considering the protection of our existing borders. For example, in case of Pakistan, if there are no other threats, then if the population increases by some amount, the existing defense would be sufficient, so there would not be any additional marginal cost for more number of consumers that have increased. So the marginal cost of allowing an additional person to consume a given quantity of pure public good would be 0. That 0 is shown by the x-axis. Up to the point 1, the line is showing the first cost was $200, for example, or maybe $200 million or $1 trillion. But then in order to include more number of consumers of national defense, the marginal cost is 0. So the line is actually on the x-axis to represent 0 over here. Now going on to the next point, marginal cost of consuming and producing a pure public good would be constant. Why is that? Now do not mix like the cost of distribution and cost of producing. Now first we were saying that we were talking about the marginal cost of distributing the existing availability of public good to other consumers of that public good, pure public good in fact. Now in that case, since more number of consumers were included, it never there was no need to produce more public good, but the existing public good, if it is to stay at that level, it is supposed to be distributed to additional number of consumers at that given level. You do not need to for example increase your national defense every time there are few births in the country. On the other hand, now we are talking about like producing more public good. Since we discussed earlier that in case of public goods, specifically we gave an example of national defense, comparing it to general consumer oriented products, that the production process is same. You have capital, you have labor, and you get into contracts for labor, you get into contracts for capital, you hire them, and you produce that public good. The problem was in the distribution, because you cannot package it and sell it to various individuals. Specifically, that we provide national defense only to, for example, people living in for example Rawalpindi area or Faisalabad or Lahore. You give public defense to the whole, you give national defense to the whole country. So having that said and done, now going to marginal cost of consuming and producing a pure public good, when the number of units of public good, which is on the x-axis, it says that units of a pure public good per year, and on the y-axis again there is a cost in dollars. Now marginal cost of producing a pure public good, because we are assuming that average cost of producing more public good would be same, so would be constant. So in that sense, the marginal cost would also be constant. It would be increasing at a constant rate. With more number of units being produced, the marginal cost would be same. That is specifically because the public goods are not cannot be that easily distributable, like packaged and distributed. Now let us take an example of bread versus heat. This is a very good hypothetical example in order to compare the two types of goods, the pure public good and pure private good. In this case, bread would be, for example, clearly a pure private good, because there is ability to exclude and there is rivalry. Let's assume that in a room there are like 5 or 10 people. and those 5 or 10 people are every day given a daily quantity of bread and a daily quantity of heating system. Maybe they are given some oil to burn in the room or some coal to burn in the room, a fixed quantity of coal and a fixed quantity of bread. Now that fixed quantity of bread would be purely would create a rivalry. It would have a rivalry effect, and it would have the ability of exclusion. For example, if there are 5 individuals and considering their daily consumption, 3 loaves of bread are transferred to in that room per head, so that would make it 15 in total. So what would happen is that if, for example, I become a little greedy and I eat more, for example, I eat, for example, instead of 3 in my daily consumption, I eat 4. Now that would result in somebody else having to give up like 1 of his loaves of bread, and he would be getting 2 that day. So you see, there is a rivalry and there is exclusion. It is very easy to exclude people out of it, and it is very easy to create a rivalry. So it is a rival good and it is an exclusion good, so there it is a pure private good. The second good would be heat. Now in case of heat, it would be a pure public good because there is no ability to exclude and there is no rivalry. For example, in the center of the room is big enough so that the effect of heat is enough to take the temperature, for example, to maybe 25 or 26 degrees centigrade. So if we heat that from the center, so how can you exclude somebody from it if there are like 5 people in the room? We are assuming a reasonable size room, not a very big hall or something. So in that room it is very difficult to create a rivalry, because once the heating is there, once the coal is burnt or when the oil is burnt, the amount of heat being produced would distribute equally inside the room, and you cannot exclude people out of it, and you cannot like create a rivalry that if I consume more heat being generated from that stove or from that stove burning coal or oil, I cannot consume extra out of it, so that someone else is worried that if he consumes more, my quantity would reduce, just like in the case of bread. So heat would be a pure public good, while heat would be a pure public good, while bread would be a pure private good. I hope now this example clearly explains or differentiates the concept of pure private good and pure public good. Now later on we would be discussing for example how those goods are supplied in the market. So before going to that, I want to be clear that everybody understands the concept of public good and private good. Any good from which exclusion is not possible and it does not create rivalry is a pure public good, which is heat in this case, in this example. And any good which from which there is ability to exclude and there is rivalry out of it, it creates rivalry. Rivalry would mean that if I consume more, there would be less available for consumption of others. That would be a pure private good. Further, like in case of heat, another characteristic of pure public good is that there are positive externalities originating from it, while in case of bread there is no externality originating from it. Like if I consume 1 loaf of bread, that would not benefit anyone else. But if there is heat, for example, specifically because of me in that room, everyone else would benefit from it. So these this one example giving bread versus heat that is being displayed on the slide clearly defines the pure public good and the concept of pure private good, and then we would be discussing the goods that are in between. Now the slide that just showed up right now is provision of private good and public goods, markets and government. There are like 2 types of public goods, which would be price excludable public goods versus congestible public goods. We would be discussing these in few minutes, like in few seconds. It is very difficult to generalize like the method of production and for example distribution of the public goods and private goods. For example, like there are private goods that are individually consumed, but they are supplied through the market. For example, supply of electricity and transport services and other public utilities. Then there are non-rival goods which are produced and supplied, for example television and community services, and all these goods are privately supplied in they have many externalities as well. Now then there are like goods which are produced through, for example, private production process or private setups, and then they are also provided by public sector institutions. For example, there are public as well as private schools. Now all this shows that it is very difficult to generalize how the goods are supplied to the consumer for consumption just based on like whether they are private goods and whether they are public goods. We considered also an example the goods that are privately produced and then supplied, those are non-rival goods, for example television and for example community services and clubs, but they have excludability, but they are non-rival in nature. Then there are goods, for example, which are consumed individually and privately, like for example electricity or transport services that are supplied in the to the consumers. Then there are also goods which are for example supplied through, for example public as well as political institutions, as well as like through private production. For example, there are private and public colleges and schools and universities operating in every country. Now that represents that there is like a debate, there is like for example no specific generalization in which for example the theory on public finance would generalize that this is how it should be, unless we define the criteria for efficiency, that this is what it would be efficient and this is what it would not be efficient. Now in this case, what would be price excludable public goods? For example, electricity would be a price excludable public good. Electricity is supplied privately to every household and to every industry, and those individuals who do not pay for it might not be able to use for it unless there are leakages in the system, and that is a separate debate, but theoretically it is a price excludable public good. Then there are congestible public goods. Congestible public goods are those goods, for example there would be a road and many people start to use it, but every time another individual starts to use that road, its utility for the individuals who are already traveling on that road reduces. So just like in the case of externalities, we discussed that people already living in cities, when more land is developed, there is more flooding in the streets. So the use for them, there is congestion in the streets, and that results into flooding as well. So the use of one individual might, roads are non-rival in nature up to a certain level, which I was discussing before, and I said that we would come back to it again. For example, there is a road going from in between any 2 points, point A and B. Every day, like for example 100 individuals travel on it, for example from point B to A. Now let's assume that now there are 5 more individuals who want to get up on that road and use it from point B to A, but that would reduce the utility of that road in terms of time, in terms of cost of traveling that road for the 100th individual or everyone else on that road, because that would create a congestion. So public goods are, there are congestible public goods, and that specific example would be, for example, certain facilities that are controlled through costing of the government. For example, public clubs that are like, they require membership, they are also congestible. To avoid that congestibility, that represents a cost. If there is an excessive use of motorway by the public of Pakistan, that you would see that in few years the government would increase the toll on for getting on the motorway. Apart from the cost of repairing and maintaining that toll would also be to discourage the excessive use and to avoid congestion. Now, so price excludable public good, which I already gave an example, excludability but no rivalry. Another type of good is a price excludable public good, no rivalry but exclusion is very easy. For example, country clubs and cable TV. Why do you need to exclude those people? Because what you need to do is people who do not pay for it do not need to use that good. And country clubs, or for example, there are certain clubs in Pakistan as well whose memberships are very expensive, like Islamabad club or Lahore club, and these memberships are expensive because so that number one, there is excludability. People who do not pay for it, they cannot use it. And then secondly, to avoid congestion of those services, the rates are kept high. And third thing is that any single individual who want to use the facility would not be able to bear the cost of those facilities. So people as a whole, as a group, when they use that, all those members in fact, when they pool their resources, they can pay for those facilities. And same would be for cable TV distribution. For example, cable operators bear a huge cost of providing those international TV channels to every home. So if individual houses pool their resources, they are paying for their single use. Now what happens is, if the excludability is because there is no congestion, number one, but in certain, of course in this case there would be minimal congestion. But the main thing is that people who do not pay for it would not be able to use it, and that is excludability, and there is no rivalry in these cases. Then the opposite example, where there is rivalry but there is no excludability, there are public goods where after a point the enjoyment received by the consumer is diminished by crowding or congestion. These are so-called congestible public goods, and two examples over here are roads and parks. And roads and parks, when they get congested, their use for the last individual, the marginal cost increases in fact, the last for his use, and the utility decreases. Now if we can we can show this like in terms of an example. For example, a congestible public good over here, the graph represents, on the left side there is marginal cost, and then number of consumers per hour is on the y-axis, and number one was at point if you look at it x-axis, then there is, when the number of consumers per hour is 1, the marginal cost per user is 0. This is a similar graph where we said that marginal cost of distributing a public good would be 0 for the pure public goods. But then in this case, marginal cost is 0 up to a certain level, for example n number of users. But when we go to those n numbers of users, the marginal cost starts to increase, and that is the reason why these goods are congestible. The example would be roads, and the example would be parks over here. Now I was saying again and again that don't worry about these explanations, we would come to that very soon. Now here is a table showing alternate means of producing, distributing and financing goods and services. We started with the statement that it is very difficult to generalize the concept of producing and distributing the public goods. So in this case, we are showing different examples. We have divided them into 4 categories. There are 2 extremes: pure public goods on the top, pure private goods on the top, and pure public goods on the bottom in the next slide over here. Now we would and then in between there are price excludable public goods and congestible public goods. Now let us start with the first one, which is pure private good. In case of pure private good, as we discussed, that there is no externality, number one, which is very important. And then there is low cost exclusion. Low cost exclusion would mean that the cost of excluding people from the use of that good is not high. For example, we can say government controlled tobacco store, for example, or maybe clothing and cars and food stamps, all that stuff. Now what would happen is that in these cases, the cost of excludability is not very high, or even like putting a toll plaza on a road, that the cost of excluding people who are not willing to pay for it is not that high. Now this characteristic, look at the first two rows, and we would talk about all these columns subsequently. The first two rows represents pure private goods with no externality and low cost inclusion. The first one is like private firms and government, and then in second row you can see government, private firms under contract with the government. Now in terms of means of distribution, for in the first case where there are private firms, it would be markets and direct unit charge for distribution of each good. Now since there is no externality involved, and since there is low cost in exclusion, therefore direct unit can be charged. In terms of financing these goods, which is like the fourth column, it would be revenue from sales basically, since there is a direct unit being charged. So the revenue from sales would be used to finance the distribution and production of these goods. Then in case of public good example, it would be food, clothing, cars, and in terms of private good example, it would be government liquor stores, for example, government tobacco monopoly. Now going down to the second row, government, where there is government and private firms, in terms of means of distribution, there is no direct charge, eligibility to consume various amounts determined politically. Now these would mostly be, for example, food items for people who are like you can say lower income class, and for example health facilities for those individuals, to low income citizens basically. So in this case there would be no, these are government subsidized items, or maybe not even subsidized, just of course subsidized, but completely free items for those low income class citizens. Now in this case there would be no direct charge. Eligibility to consume various amounts would be determined politically. One example of this can be, for example, Benazir income support program. In case of Benazir income support program, there are no widespread externalities out of it, and then there is low cost exclusion. So in this case, now what would be the methods of finance? Method of finance would be taxes, because there is no direct unit charge to it, and people who are eligible to get it would be getting it, and the government would be financing that through taxes. Then government distribution of medical services and food to low income citizens would be a private example, because private in a sense that it would be utilized individually. Then coming down to third, in second type and the third row, which is price excludable public goods. There are external benefits when produced or consumed, and there is again low cost exclusion out of it. So they would be produced by either means of production would be, now we would be talking about third and fourth row, and we would be discussing the third row first in terms of columns, and then we would be discussing the fourth row in terms of columns. Now there would be private firms, and means of distribution would be through the markets. There would be a direct unit charge, and these goods might be subsidized. Then in terms of methods of finance, there would be revenue from the sales tax, and examples of public goods would be schools, hospitals, transportation network, for example, and there would be, for private example, would be transit facilities and public hospitals. Now in this case you can see that these are like not the pure private goods, but they are price excludable public goods. As I said, that we have divided them into four categories. There are pure private goods, there are price excludable public goods which have no rivalry, but they do have for example low cost excludability. Then in terms of congestible public goods, that would be coming up. We would have, for example, rivalry as well as but no excludability. Let's move on to the fourth column, where price excludable public goods are being discussed, and it would be the means of production would be through government or private firms under the contract of the government. There would be no direct charge. Consumption available or required only at collectively chosen quantity and quality. And the methods of finance would be taxes, and in case of private example, it would be public schools, public sanitation, and vaccinations. Like for example, in case of Pakistan, the polio vaccine that is done at a widespread level by the government, and there is no direct unit charge, and the quantity, the requirement of production would be based on the quantity and the available quality, and it is completely financed by the taxes. And yeah, that would be a perfect example for that. Now moving on, there is like congestible public goods, the third category. Now we are talking about this is covered in like the first and second row of a similar table. In fact, third and fourth row, if you include the headers inside it. Now that would be collectively consumed benefits subject to crowding, possibility of exclusion. Now it is a congestible public good. We define congestible public goods that when there is excessive use of that good, the utility derived from the first individual or the people already using it decreases with including every other individual inside it up to a certain level. Now that was shown by increasing marginal cost of use of that good for the individuals who are using it. Now first it would be by private firms and government. Now means of distribution would be fees for the right to use the facilities sold in the market, and the method of finance in this case would be revenue from sales, and public example would be clubs, theaters, amusement parks, sporting events, and private examples would be public golf courses and roads. Then going on to the second column, it would be government and private firms under contract with the government. There would be no direct user charge or just only a partial charge, and there would be taxes and as well as revenues from the sales, and examples would again be public parks, public recreations, roads and bridges. Now there are certain charges and taxes on it to avoid congestion in the use of those products for the existing users. Then the last one would be pure public goods, which are collectively consumed, which have collectively consumed benefits, not subject to crowding, high cost exclusion. It is very difficult, or in fact the cost of exclusion is very, very high. Now for example, it can be done by private firms and private firms authorized by the government or government themselves, or government under the contract, government who has given the contract to the private firms. In this case, there would be no direct unit charge, quantity dependent on amount collected, no direct unit charge on quantity and of service and quality of service collectively chosen. Now in this case, the methods of finance would be fees, contributions and taxes. Public example would be private charity, and private example would be public television and radio, national defense and environmental protection. All these would be, for example, examples of the goods in which we have, as we said, that it is very difficult to define a criteria for the producing, distributing and consuming of those goods. So we have made like 4 categories over here. The first category was pure private good, then price excludable public goods, then congestible public goods, and then pure public goods. And we have discussed certain categories under which they might fall in case of either being financed by the government through taxes, or there is revenue either being supplied privately in the market or like open for the public, like for example recreational parks or roads. Now how can we classify goods according to the degree of rivalry and excludability in terms of benefits of their use? Now this is a box showing on the x-axis is rivalry, where there is no rivalry. The good, the origin represents there is no rivalry, and on the right hand side of the x-axis there is 1 representing the maximum level of rivalry. Then on the y-axis there is excludability. On origin of the y-axis there is 0 representing no or very high cost excludability, and on 1 it represents for example maximum or very low cost excludability automatically. So this table represents number 1. Where would you think would be a pure public good? Very good, very right answer, I hope. B represents the pure public good, because pure public good would have 0 rivalry and would have 0 excludability. It would be very costly to exclude number of people who are not using that good, and it would have no rivalry. So the 2 characteristics of public good, non-rivalry and non-excludability, would represent the point B. Then what would A represent? A would represent all those goods which are for example the cost of excludability is very low and are in rival consumption. So pure private goods would come at point A. For example, producing a chocolate for somebody, and only those people who can pay for it can buy that, and its supply is limited. So whenever I use one chocolate, the result would be there would be shortage for other individual. What would point C and point H represent? Can you think of any examples? I hope you can right now, but let's say we define point B as pure public good, point A as pure private good. Point C would be representing a good in which the excludability is very high but there is no rivalry. Can you think of any example? For example, we discussed that TV transmission was a public good in which there was no rivalry but there was excludability from it, and we categorized it as price excludable public good with no rivalry. So C would represent a public good like TV transmissions and programs. And what would H represent then? H would represent a certain level of excludability and certain level of rivalry, and those would be congestible public goods which are subject to congestion with excessive use, in which case we discussed that the marginal cost of the consumer increases with increase in for example use of that road. So H would represent a good which has certain rivalry in terms of congestion. Up to a certain level the congestion increases, and that's why there is rivalry and there is exclusion on it, and for that we consider an example of a road and for example a motorway on which there is a toll, and if government wants to exclude people from that road, they can just increase the toll, and people who cannot afford that cost of entering on the motorway, they would not, and they would use some other mechanisms or means of transportation. So then the most important thing that I wanted to highlight over here, one of the most important things that I wanted to highlight here was taking education as a public good. Now education, there are like public universities and there are private universities, and public universities would be for example charging fees from the students. Those fees are subsidized, and then there are private universities who would be universities or institutions or elementary schools or high schools who would be charging a substantial amount of fee for that. So in this case, whether it is provided by the political institutions also through the government, like federal government and provincial government, they have their schools in almost all the cities and regions, and then there are private schools who are also operating over there. So would education have an externality for that? Now most of the people are of the view that education has an externality, because in terms of citizens being more responsible, citizens being more productive. For example, if a citizen would be capable of, for example, reading based on, maybe just we're considering that elementary education or basic level education is made mandatory for the citizens of a country. In that case, it would always pay to have more people who can read themselves and who can just do basic computational skills to manage their finances, and who can behave as responsible citizens of the country, who know the worth of, for example, education, and who know the worth of, for example, use of the other public goods. So then the point is that certain people would never understand the importance of elementary education, maybe because of their income constraints or maybe their backgrounds, but it is important for the governments to ensure the use of this good by the people, and that good is being provided by as a public good at cheaper rates. But still, people who consider that education has a positive externality, and I hope you remember how we resolved externalities, how we internalized the externalities in case of, for example, there was negative externality. We defined that the government would go and tax it, but if there is positive externality, government would go and subsidize that positive externality. So if government would subsidize this positive externality, then there would be cheaper education at public schools, which are somehow financed by their own expenses and through taxes as well, collected by the government. So in this example, education would be a public good, and it would have its positive externalities on the economy as a whole. Before I say goodbye to you guys, I would like to summarize this lecture, what we discussed through this whole approximately maybe 1 hour. We defined the pure public goods. We started with national defense, and we found out that national defense is some sort of non-excludable and non-rival sort of a public good, and then we, based on these definitions, we identified pure public good and pure private goods. Pure public goods are those goods which have no exclusion and which are non-rival, and pure private goods are those goods which have rivalry specifically and low cost excludability. Then we moved on, and discussing these goods, we identified, for example, 4 different categories of public and private goods, and we said that there were pure private goods on number 1. Then there were price excludable public goods, in which it is very easy to exclude low cost inclusion, and it is very easy to exclude the people who are not paying for the use of that public good. Then we discussed the congestible public goods, which were sort of non-rival but price excludable, which were became rival after certain quantity of users is increased, and those were also price excludable. Then we discussed the pure public goods, in which case there were no exclusion and no rivalry cases. And we summarized all this discussion on the current slide that you are looking at, and this slide represented at point B represented the pure public good, in which there is zero rivalry and there is zero excludability, and point A represented for example maximum excludability and maximum rivalry. Then there were intermediate points in which there was no rivalry but there was excludability, represented by point C, TV programs. And then there is point H, in which case, for example, these are congestible public goods, in which case there is some rivalry, and due to its excessive use resulting into decreased utility for the individuals who are already using it, and increased marginal cost of its use, and then there is possibility to exclude individuals from it. And I hope you have understood the concept of public and private goods, and in the next lecture we would be taking it on further to include further topics and have a further debate on the public and private goods. See you soon.